at the role of a coach. So as a coach, we have several hats that we wear at different times. We have several roles that we're actually doing, from looking after the group as far as like, their safety kind of aspects, but also that guiding aspect, and that teacher hat needs to go on at times as well. So we've got lots of different things that we're looking at as an actual coach. We're going to focus a little bit more on that actual coach aspect, that teacher kind of aspect, that facilitator of learning, whatever words we want to string together. That's kind of what we're on about for the next little bit. So as coaches, we've got a few basic areas, or two different sides of the, two different opposite ends of the spectrum. That's where I'm going with this. We can be more of a behaviorist kind of coach or a constructivist kind of coach, which can mean that we're more coach-centered. So as a coach, I've got all the power. I'm deciding what's happening, how things are going, and I'm basing how I think the others are learning by what I can see. So I'm observing what they're doing, and that's how I know that they're succeeding. Or the other end of things, we've kind of got that constructivist approach, where I'm very much working more with the student. They're coming up with what needs to happen, how they want things to happen, the process they want to go through, the timings of which they want things to happen, and that side of it. So we've got opposite ends of the spectrum. As we know, as coaches, we don't sit at one end or the other. We don't have a particular style or a particular approach that we always do. There are needs for certain coaching approaches to happen at certain times, and at other times, other coaching approaches are more necessary. If we always told everyone the answer for everything, and we're very dogmatic in our approach and told people, you need to hold your paddle at this certain angle, you need to place it in at that point in the front of your kayak, so on and so forth, for a skill to look a certain way, it may not feel right for that individual based on their body, based on the type of water they're maneuvering within. So it could be better to have more of that constructivist approach, that student-centered approach, where we're trying to guide them to the answers. We're getting them to play with a few varieties, a few variables of how things can come together, so they're able to experiment and they're able to come up with a way of things happening for that environment. But because they've gone through that process, they've also got an idea of how it could work in a lesser environment or a greater environment. For instance, ferry gliding, we'll go back to that example. If I told people on a stretch of water that to ferry glide across, you have to point your boat at this angle and you have to paddle this amount, that's the way you ferry glide, it would be great for that one bit of water. But as soon as we move to another bit of water, they need to do things a little bit differently. If it's faster flowing, they may need to have less angle. If it's not flowing as fast, they may be able to open up their angle a little bit more. They may need to paddle a little bit harder if it's a narrower gap and faster flowing. Whereas if it's wider and a lot less flow, again, they can paddle a little bit less. So if we get people to experiment with how things work, it may be better for them to develop a greater degree of understanding of how things happen. And that's that constructivist angle, that constructivist approach on that side of things. As I mentioned, as coaches, we've got a big spectrum of areas we're actually operating within. So we don't just have the coach-centered and the student-centered kind of over here. I'm trying to have my hands in the camera angle so you can just about see that. But we've got, like, people can go out and they can self-coach. Today, whilst I was out canoeing, I was very much coaching myself on a few different poling techniques and working out different ways of things happening. I could go back to someone else and I could ask, oh, this is what I was finding, and they can give me a bit of input. So they can assist me with my learning, but they weren't actually there at the time to go through the process. I'm coaching myself with a little bit of assistance from someone else. Guided discovery, we can pose some questions, we can give some parameters, we can give some options for people to play with, and they can come up with the answers from there. Peer coaching is another role of a coach that we can try and implement, where we've got a group of people and we're getting them to work on a particular task as a group, and they're coming up with a consensus of opinion. They're coaching each other, and they're finding out what works best for a collective group. Or, as I mentioned earlier, it can be that completely coach-led approach where the coach is dictating how things need to happen, where things need to go, and how it all kind of comes together. They are like the fountain of all knowledge, in effect, and the student is just there as a sponge to try and absorb everything. At times that can be great, but it's important to have that fluidity and that ability to change across. I'm sure we all know people who are coaches who are very good at different parts of that. I'm sure you can name coaches that come to head who are come into your thought process who are very good at that guided discovery aspect, and that's what they do for the majority of their coaching. And they like posing questions, but sometimes people just want the answer. They just want to know, what do I need to do for this to work? And they might get a little bit too frustrated with an overly or just a guided discovery approach. The same way that if someone was just telling everyone all the answers, they may get bored because they're not able to actually contribute themselves and to give their own opinion back onto things. So that's where we start off with the coaching approach. Lots of different angles, lots of different ways of doing things. There isn't necessarily a correct way, an incorrect way, but there are lots of different ways to achieve the objective of assisting someone to get better at their paddling, which is what we're aiming to do as coaches. We're working with the individual for them to get better at what they want to get better at. Caption of the role of a coach, or the different roles of a coach. Within different coaching courses, we spend a lot of time looking at this, and trying to boil it down into a few minutes is fairly difficult, but hopefully that covered a lot of different angles.
No, that was pretty good for a whistle-stop tour. The only thing I'd add possibly is guided discovery works really, really well, but it's got a massive trapdoor in it that people need to be aware of, because guided discovery is about almost you knowing the outcome that you want, and then you set tasks and ask questions to lead people into that task to get to that outcome. And the problem is when they come back with the answer you wasn't expecting, and then you've got to have the confidence and the technical knowledge to then almost dig yourself out of a hole. So, for example, if we were experimenting with tandem canoeing, where's the best place for our tandem crew to sit? It's quite normal for a tandem crew to come back and go, well, actually, it works really well, excuse me, with the stern paddler at the back of the boat and the bow paddler in the middle of the boat. And that might not be the answer that you thought was going to happen. So that's where you need to be able to then play with it a bit more and explore a bit more to get to the outcome you might have wanted, which is actually, I want the bow person in the front of the boat and the stern person in the back of the boat. Because technically they're correct if they come back with that answer. So it's always something to be wary of, that you might not get the answer you wanted. So having strategies to deal with that is a good thing. Everything else I think was pretty straightforward. So maybe for some of our more experienced coaches, we used to use the coaching spectrum quite a lot, Moster and Astor's coaching spectrum. And we've kind of condensed that down now into the constructive side and the behaviorism side, and then link it into various parts of that coaching spectrum.
Before I click on to the next part, were there any questions on that kind of area, or any additional inputs, or does anyone want me to elaborate on any areas? Because it was a fairly whistle-stop tour, as I mentioned.
Certainly, on that point about Paul's point about the ability to take expectations of what you're seeing from the self-guided, the classic example for that for me is at the scenario stage of an FSRT. You have in your head, you set a scenario of some description. You have in your head what you want to see from that, but certainly 6 times out of 10, the clients, the people on the water, come up with other things you didn't even see coming. And they can be enlightening, and sometimes you may need to alter the perspective of what they're trying to do, but they can be very enlightening and sometimes very amusing.
Definitely, yeah, and it's very Yeah, it's very interesting. Like, so as coaches, like, we go, as Paul mentioned, like, going into those traps at times where we let people loose and people go overly divergent and they come up with obscure answers and things which we wouldn't have thought of at all. So the way we pose that guided discovery can be massively important. It can definitely assist people with their knowledge and their understanding of how things work rather than just giving an answer. So it can be very powerful in the actual learning and coaching process, but it's important to give some kind of, I find anyway, to give constraints with what kind of things we're looking at, or to single it down to one part, one area. So for instance, if I'm looking at forward paddling, it could be where the paddle blade goes into the water and where it comes out again. So they're looking at one thing. Then I could look at posture. Then I could look at what their head's doing. Then I can start to break things down a little bit. So I'm really guiding them to the answers, but by doing it one small bit at a time. Could be a process.